Jamshid, the king of Persia's wife, who had a name, of course, a name that was not recorded or remembered, as you can imagine, though it is important, as you will later discover. But she has to have a name, if she's the heroine of the story, said one of the wine tasters. Can't you just give her a name? Oh no, said the swollen-gummed viticulturist. No, this is how the story is told and how it will be told today again. As I was saying, this young wife, whose name is not remembered or recorded, the young wife of Jamshid, was not at all content in the desert. Her shame was too terrible, her loss of a great love too complete, and it pressed her to the sand with the flat of its palm, with all that sky behind it, a sky that felt no longer very gentle at all. So Jamshid, the king of Persia's young wife, decided to die. But how, you ask? As you can imagine, death in the wilderness of the desert is long and slow, even before birds large enough to shake the bones out of a body such as that of the young wife of Jamshid's do so and leave them to bake in the sun, unshrouded and unburied. The young wife of Jamshid, who's actually a smart, pious young woman after all, knew this well and hatched a plan to secret herself back into the great palace, the palace of Jamshid, the king of Persia, from which she had just been banished, where her death might be made more swift and shrouded. It was then that the young wife of Jamshid came upon a small oasis, an oasis populated by the people of Persia, Jamshid, the king of Persia's own miserable, unhappy people. For from the outer walls of Jamshid's great palace to the hovels skirting the king of Persia's few oases, not one row of teeth glimmered full above the other, not one pig mucked nor donkey brayed. For the king of Persia's own people were, in fact, more thirsty than the sand stretching to the great palace, and therefore quite a miserable, unhappy people altogether. There in the oasis, Jamshid's young wife came upon a desert woman, a woman of the desert who knew sandy palms as well as stars, who was dirtier than the muck in which a pig might roll, hairier than any braying donkey, as you can imagine, who sat low in a hovel tracing lines in her own thirsty sand. Desert woman, questioned the young wife of Jamshid, arriving at the oasis of miserable, unhappy people. Desert woman, said Jamshid's own young wife. Across the desert lies a great palace where I hold a great love, a palace from which I have been banished and to which I must arrive to meet my swift, shrouded death. And so the desert woman, the hairy woman of the desert, dirtier than muck, smiled one toothless smile, the only smile to have been smiled in the oasis of miserable, unhappy people in the kingdom of Jamshid, the king of Persia, almost ever. It was then that from the open mouth of the desert woman sifted the wind from across the great dunes, the sound of stars and empty sands, and with it came a terrible, miserable stench. The desert woman, the hairy woman of the desert, reached behind her empty lips and pulled from them one clay bead, a clay bead plainer than her own thirsty sand. It was then that the young wife, Jamshid's own young wife, plucked the bead from between the desert woman's fingers and slipped it between her own shining teeth. At once the young wife's tongue grew as cool as the night winds, and forgot the terrible thirst of the people, the thirst of the kingdom of Jamshid, the kingdom of Persia's own miserable, unhappy people. Go, croaked the woman of the desert, in a single low croak that may have been her very last. It took many days to find the great palace, days that are not remembered or recorded, as you can imagine, by anyone but the great birds who passed their long shadows across the sand in front of and behind the young wife of Jamshid, the king of Persia's wife. The young wife carrying the woman of the desert's own clay bead in her mouth. When she finally did arrive, and slipped under the wooden hatch in the flat of the sand outside the walls of the great palace, and down into the cool cellar below the palace, the young wife of Jamshid could not believe her terrible luck, to have come so far and be only half dead, and she fell to the cold floor with weariness, and the clay bead slipped from her tongue to dissolve into dust. There in the cellar, where the goods of the great palace were kept out of the heat and away from flies, in the most terrible luck of the young wife of Jamshid, the king of Persia, there lay, just at her side, just there on the cold floor of the cellar, a large jug marked poison. This jug was not like any other jug of poison found in the palace of Jamshid. This jug, in fact, was a jug of juice squeezed from the grapevines grown in that very inner courtyard where the wife's own great love sat. This jug had sat for much too long, out of the way, in that cold cellar, and had, according to those in the palace, undoubtedly spoiled to the point that it was now undrinkable. So spoiled that it was understood that the juice would certainly cause the drinker to perish, as you can imagine. The young wife of Jamshid raised the jug above her head. Its weight nearly overcame her, and she drank far too quickly with gulps far too great. In the cellar floor of the palace, Jamshid's own young wife, the wife banished from the harem where the grapes that made the juice were growing, where her own great love rested, swallowed heavily from a jug marked poison until it was nearly gone. As you know, as you can imagine, this juice was not what it seemed. Not to those in the king of Persia's own palace or to Jamshid's own young wife, whose terrible luck had just run out. Not even Jamshid, the king of Persia, had imagined was that the very air and sky, the very sand dotted with oases, carried the ingredients for a process that turns juice into not juice. That the spoiling of this juice was actually its blending with this ingredient, its shift into what we know today, not as juice or as poison, but as wine. And so, unlike the eunuch, dead eunuch, unlike others banished from the great palace of the king of Persia to the wilderness of the desert alone, the young wife of Jamshid did not become dead, but only very drunk. Her spirits were then lifted, as you can imagine, so much that she forgot herself and the wilderness. She forgot the single cloud on the horizon and the shadows of giant birds and the windy mouth of the desert woman, and she walked herself right on up to the palace of Jamshid, the king of Persia, right on up to the throne room where the king, who was, after all, still her husband, sat on his throne. Well, Jamshid, the king of Persia, was unpleased, but not as unpleased as he might have been had he not been seeing his own young wife. And it took only a little convincing and only one royal assayer's tasting before Jamshid, the king of Persia, agreed to try this special juice before commencing any chopping. And this is why, as I've said, the young wife of Jamshid, the king of Persia's name is important, though unremembered, because it is she, in fact, who is the legendary discoverer of wine. The young wife who was shamed and banished from her own great love and tasted the bead of the thirsty desert woman, who sought death but instead saved her own life and made happy Jamshid, the king of Persia. So happy that no chopping was commenced, but instead a great feast was held and more jugs of wine were consumed than ever before. So many that Jamshid, the king of Persia, who had unhappy people, was persuaded to give some to those populating his oases, to share his own wine with those who soon became much less thirsty than the sand surrounding them. And so the land remained glad and at peace, for a few years at least, as you might or might not be able to imagine. And that's how it goes, the legend of Jamshid, the king of Persia, and his harem, and the banished woman and the mistaken poison, though, as you can imagine, it should probably be called something else. Finished the swollen, gummed viticulturist. At this moment there was a very small old man sitting on the old wood bar, holding a giant mug, and the old man spoke from his seat atop the bar, where the legend had just been told. "Phooey," said the small toothless little man at the bar. "Phooey," slamming his mug. "The origin of wine is China, of course, as are all things original and old." "China," responded the swollen gummed viticulturist, "but what of Persia and Greece and the classic vineyards? The very vineyards that follow the legend I've just told here, and now upon this bar upon which you sit." "China," responded the old man, sputtering his wine, "where men and women in Jihao first mixed rice and honey and fruit to make wine, long before there were any kings in Persia, or harems, or desert women, or any of the sort." "Well, go on," said the swollen gummed viticulturist, surprised. "Well," sputtered the old man, "don't for a minute think that the Chinese had no grapes, that this disqualifies them. They had wild grapes too. Yes, grapes that were used to make grape wine after Jihao. Still long before the kings of Persia, or harems, or desert women mistook wine for any poison." "Phooey," finished the small old man, very satisfied. "Not true," said a soft voice from the window, a voice from the mouth of a sheep at the window, one of the swollen gummed viticulturist's own sheep, standing just outside the window of the bar. "The origin of wine is sheep. Sheep, after all, who ate overripe fruit and grew happy and loose and bounding long before the Chinese in Jihao. Sheep who first discovered the wonders of wine and fermentation and showed it to ancient shepherds. Sheep, after all." "Well," said the swollen gummed viticulturist, who was by now very tired and nearly very drunk. "I can imagine so," glancing sidelong at the sheep. "Well," he said to the tasters across the bar, "was that satisfactory? Does that answer your question? The origin is sheep, after all." But the tasters did not answer, because they did not hear, because, as you can imagine, their heads were fast asleep on the bar among the long-stemmed grasses in the slanted winter sun. Thank you.
Good job. Let's have one more round of applause for both Justin and Sarah. As Sarah said, we're gonna take a quick break, and we'll be sending a hat hat around to collect donations for the lovely costume.